Welcome to TeamTalk from TeamKinetic, the podcast that takes a deeper dive into volunteer management. With me, Chris Martin. This week's episode of TeamTalk with me, Chris Martin, is with Andy Broomhead, who is a director at the Association of Volunteer Managers, and is the second in our series of chats with guys that are involved with the Association of Volunteer Managers, and he's also the head of volunteering at Diabetes UK. It was great to chat to Andy, for him to give us a little bit of time, and it was really interesting to hear his journey to becoming a volunteer manager, because this is something of an unusual journey. I hope you enjoy this chat. It's really quite interesting, and we cover a lot of ground and have a lot of thoughts around what's really the secret ingredient, if you will, to becoming a great volunteer manager, and understanding that tricky balancing act between the needs of the volunteers and the needs of the organisation. If you have anything you want to send in to us, or any feedback you want to send, then please do feel free to email me at chris@teamkinetic.co.uk. We do read every email. Please do give us a 5-star review for the podcast, as that can only do us good and get more people listening. Thanks a lot. Take care and enjoy the pod. Today I'm joined by Andy Broomhead. He's the director of the Association of Volunteer Managers, and he's the head of volunteering at Diabetes UK. Welcome to the podcast, Andy.
Thanks, Chris. Nice to be here.
You're part of our little series that we're doing with directors from the Association of Volunteer Managers, and we'll have a little bit of chat about the Association of Volunteer Managers in a little bit. But I guess as with all these, we'll start right at the beginning. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing, and how you got here today. Tell us a little bit, your backstory.
Yeah. Okay. So probably kind of coming at it from two angles, I guess. So I've had diabetes myself for 20 years. So I've had a connection to the charity that I work for a really, really long time. I started out volunteering for Diabetes UK back in 2012, and that kind of really got me the bug for that volunteering in itself, I think.
Yeah.
My professional background at the time was much more around kind of business change, and working with largely financial services companies, which is a little bit of a leap from that into charities.
Just a bit,
yeah. But working with financial services companies, but looking at a lot more around kind of business change that was supporting customer experience.
Yep.
And at the start of 2017, I was offered the opportunity to do a small 3-month piece of work for Diabetes UK, looking at customer experience, predominantly through a fundraising and engagement background.
Okay.
But not needing any kind of fundraising experience to do that. It was much more about the customer journey rather than anything else.
Yeah, the process.
Yeah, absolutely. So a big organisation that was really kind of close to my heart, so I said yes. And at the time, they were recruiting for a head of volunteering.
Okay.
And I thought, well, actually, I know the organisation. Feel like there's a lot that I would be able to give to that. And decided to stop working for myself and kind of go back to being employed by somebody else. So yeah, I applied for the role in February, March time, 2017, and I started in April, and that was that. So yeah, coming up on almost 5 years in post as head of volunteering here now.
And that is very unusual in terms of. It's not unusual for people to come from different industries into volunteering. I don't think. I think that's quite normal. But to come at the point which you did, when you were quite established in a different career, to make that jump, what was the thinking? I'm sure there's more money in financial service management than there is in volunteering.
There definitely is. I think particularly there's a lot more money being in self-employed financial services than volunteering.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of my personal philosophy, I guess, is where do I feel like I can add value to something? Where can I do something that's going to keep me interested and keep me a little bit, on my toes, but I also feel like I'm going to be able to be good at something. I'm going to be able to help somebody at the same time.
Where can you make a difference?
Exactly.
And feel good about doing it.
A lot of us probably, work for charities for that exact same reason. There's that kind of like altruistic element that you can't really measure, but I think it's probably within most, if not all, people that are working in this sector.
It's a really interesting one, that point there, because it is altruistic, but there is a very important sense of satisfaction in that altruism. If that makes sense, it's not truly altruistic. 100%. You do because it makes you feel good as well. If that makes sense, it's deeper in the personality than just I'm doing it for the good of other people. It's a bit more, you know, I don't know. I get a bit caught up in this conversation sometimes as to
No, I know exactly what
truly
you mean.
altruistic. You know, it's
Yeah, no, I don't think anything is kind of truly altruistic. Is it? Nothing's truly selfless. But I think there is that element to it that probably drives a lot of people to work harder, do a little bit more, feel a lot more emotionally invested in something than they would be if it was just working for a bank or any other company.
And I think it's interesting as well, though, that you did come from the cause itself. You like say you suffered with diabetes, and you've appreciated some of the benefits that sort of afforded to you by being involved in the organisation and having that sort of experience. That's I think again, you get people that end up within a sort of certainly the charitable sector, maybe not necessarily originally cause driven, but got job driven, and then end up sort of involved in the cause. So yours is an interesting career path to come away. But what skills do you reckon you've been able to bring from what you were doing into what you do now?
I think a couple of things. I think actually being a volunteer for the charity first gives you a sense of what everybody's able to achieve by being a volunteer. You're bringing your own experience of that in, but you're also seeing what other people are doing and how much it affects them. And I think that's great. I think professionally, there was a lot of analytical work in what I used to do. So I think you had that ability to maybe be a little more emotionally detached from it sometimes, which I think is interesting in itself, because sometimes you feel really emotionally invested in it because it's a cause you're passionate about, an organisation that you're passionate about, but you have to have that objectivity that says actually what is happening based on how we set ourselves up to do this and support volunteers and bring people along with us. Actually, are we doing stuff because it's how we did it 10 years ago, and the landscape and the environment and everybody's reasons for being part of what we're doing have changed fundamentally? How do you bring that in? And I always think it's difficult because charities aren't businesses. We're there to support huge numbers of people, but I think there's some element of that kind of business process that helps you do that in a better way.
I agree, and I think it's a fine line between sort of that commercial mindedness and the charitable mindedness. But I think an awful lot of charities could probably benefit from being not necessarily more commercially minded, but more commercially savvy and more switched on to business thinking and process thinking, and setting themselves up with processes that would replicate what you'd see in normal business, rather than necessarily relying on goodwill and people's willingness to go above and beyond to make things happen. Yeah,
definitely. I think the bit that we sometimes fall on the right side of that line and sometimes the wrong side. But it's how are you balancing that with the experience of people that are giving up their time for free, fundamentally?
Exactly that. Yeah.
You want the kind of process, because as an organisation, you want to feel assured that you are keeping people safe, that you're putting the mission at the very centre of what you're trying to do. But at the same time, and I probably experienced this as a volunteer, at Diabetes UK and at other places as well, is that I want to engage with this, to a large degree on my terms.
Of course.
And actually, my terms and my motivations of what I want to do are really different from your kind of
your mission,
your considerations that you've got to keep in mind. And it's being sat at the table now. It's interesting to be able to see it from both sides. You can kind of 4 or 5 years after I stopped volunteering for the charity, you still kind of go back to those bits where you were sat in that volunteer shoes and thinking, actually, this didn't make sense to me at the time, and immediately being on the other side of the table, it does make sense. But how you have those conversations and how you bring that through to people, is much more difficult than I think you.
I agree.
You give people credit for when you are a volunteer. You just think, just tell me it's fine. And I have a lot of these conversations, and it's not quite as easy as that. But I think the essence of it is absolutely what we ought to do.
I think, I mean, it's one of the things I was going to talk about a little bit later, but we can have a quick chat about, because it feels it fits in now. I mean, when you look at the challenges, the organisational challenges that you face at Diabetes UK, I mean, just take COVID as an example of that, versus the challenges the volunteers face. What are your challenges, and how do they fit in with what you get back from the volunteers, if that makes sense? How do you sort of negotiate those two?
It's interesting, wasn't it? I think for COVID particularly, from day one, the way we talked about COVID and the impact on volunteering and the charity hasn't changed, and that's always been about volunteers' health and safety and well-being. Being absolutely our primary concern. We've seen all along. We're kind of coming into. We're not far off year 3 of this in some respects, are we?
Yeah, well, it's interesting as well. Your career is like half and half. You've got like
it is,
half.
Yeah. I've got 50% of the time was kind of normal, whatever we call that, and 50% of it is just kind of living in this perpetual kind of COVID stasis.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we were really clear, particularly because we knew that people with diabetes were much more likely to have poorer outcomes from COVID.
Yep.
That health, safety, and well-being was, always the top of our list. And we equally knew that for some volunteers, that wasn't the case. They were much more, I just want to get out there, do stuff. I want to help. I want to make a difference. I don't want to feel like my freedom to do what I want to do as a volunteer is being limited.
Yeah.
But you've got, I think it's always that slightly dull, but ultimately important legal bit that you've got. You can't get away from it. And
no.
I end up having a lot of frank conversations with volunteers. Like, nobody volunteers to fill paperwork in. Nobody wants these forms. But we cannot keep you safe, and you cannot keep people safe if we don't all just kind of get on with this bit.
Of course.
And that's what it's like. I remember having a conversation 2 weeks after lockdown started, so kind of right at the end of March 2020, with one of our coordinators in England. I won't say exactly where.
No.
They'd been to a meeting with one of our groups, and somebody had been for a COVID test that morning because they'd had symptoms. They'd come out to this meeting in the evening while they were waiting.
Yeah.
And they'd had a shared buffet, and everybody was just kind of, and it's kind of, you talk about it now, and it's like, it's mind-blowing to kind of think that any of us would have been in that situation. And we've all learned so much over the last 2 years, but those kinds of things, that's my responsibility. That's the charity's responsibility to keep people safe and not kind of create the environment for people to accidentally come to harm while they're trying to do something that they love. But those two things really often come up against each other. People feel that they are the best judge of what's safe for them. And it's what we've seen along, isn't it? It's vaccines, it's mask wearing. I know what's best for me, but it's not just you making the decision for.
Exactly.
And that's
it's all been supercharged and culture warred up at the minute. That's the problem, unfortunately. But
exactly.
and I can imagine that sort of plays out within your organisation at times as well. But in terms of the actual sort of response then to COVID and the challenges that posed, what were the sort of biggest lessons you learned from it all?
I think what we saw as members of staff in volunteering was that we found it a lot easier to let go than we probably thought we did. So a lot of what we talked about, a lot of what we talked about over, kind of over years is how do we support more people to be a little bit more independent, do the things they want to do. And, is technology some of the answer to that? And I think we always felt like yes, but we were never really sure that our volunteers and maybe volunteering more broadly across the sector would really take to it in a way.
I think that's definitely something we've picked up, that the whole push toward digital across the board, as the people's faith in it. There's always the argument, people won't do it, or a bit nervous, won't get the uptake we want. So is it worth the cost benefit analysis? Is it worth the effort doing it?
Yeah.
And I think having it forced upon people has kind of made that case to some extent now, that every organisation's re-looking at those decisions and thinking, can we afford not to do it? Because it turns out that people, if you take your 80-20 rule, 80% of people do just crack on. We might have to support those 20, but let the 80% of people, get on with it if they can do. So it's an interesting one. I think that definitely.
Yeah, I think we saw some of our volunteers being ahead of us in terms of getting set up to organise meetings and get-togethers and stuff online. They were way ahead of the curve than we were. And, we probably had our mind's eye for a little while.
They can move that bit quicker than you can, though.
They can. Yeah, exactly. That's kind of again that kind of I'm coming on 2-3 weeks later with like trying to slightly make them feel slightly more encumbered with a bit of process. But equally, we learned where to pitch that. So we saw some groups that were really early on in that stage having kind of interlopers into Zoom meetings, and I think we stayed away from what we normally would have done, which was try and shut it all down and control it all. Is that actually we know that this is really important for your physical and mental health.
Of course,
I remember going back and thinking, this will be over in 3 months. And here we are, kind of
I
like,
think you mean everybody else as well.
yeah. I mean, I
haven't got
remember
any longer
booking
than 3
meetings
months. Yeah,
I remember booking meetings with my team saying, "Oh, we'll do these. We'll have these kind of like daily, weekly catch-up things, and then we'll put them in for 3 months. That's a recurring thing in Outlook."
Yeah.
And actually, here we are. These things still run now, and
yep, still sat in the kitchen on Zoom calls.
Honestly, mate, nearly 3 years into it, still sat in my kitchen. But I think we were much more pragmatic about what information people needed to be able to get on and do what they do. I think, like a lot of organisations, we were scrambling around to understand what our technology solution was.
Do you think you will stay as pragmatic as an organisation, or do you think it starts to move back towards the?
That's an interesting question.
Yeah,
I think as with anything, those kind of old habits are sometimes hard to wean yourself off.
Yep.
But I think I don't feel like it's gone back to what it would have done before. I think we're coming across new challenges. I think we're coming across new ways that we need to support people and new risks we need to be mindful of, but new opportunities we can take.
Of course.
We're not making it up on the fly. It's more organised than that. But you have to be much more adaptive, I think, and we talk about
open-minded to the ups and downs of these things, and it might not work the first time, not even work the second time, but by the third time, we might just about have it right. Yeah.
And I think that comes down to a lot of expectation. I think a lot of people look to me necessarily, but look to us because we should have the answers. And we saw that through all the COVID briefings. There was this kind of expectation that we were on the inside track of what was going to get announced. We were all sat glued to telly at 6 o'clock every evening, same as all our volunteers.
Frantically writing policy on the back of it.
Yeah, what does this mean for us? What have we got to do? And you'd kind of get an email at 8 o'clock saying, "Well, what does this announcement mean for me?" And it's like, I haven't finished reading.
I don't know yet.
And I think that was interesting, that how much probably the entire sector, and certainly a lot of my colleagues in volunteering, those kind of unofficial working hours probably extended out to whatever the
just a bit.
10 briefing was at 6 o'clock.
Yep.
Because we all had to kind of come in the next morning and be like, right, this is what we're saying now. And that agility and that reactivity to what was happening, I don't think any of us have lived through anything like that before. And I think we've retained a lot of that good practice. I think we continue to do that as much as we can. And I think it's really taught us to be more clear when we talk about expectation. So we're asking you to do this because this somebody said this is what it means for Diabetes UK, this is what it means for you as a volunteer. Those lines of sight, I think, have always been really important. But I think COVID has helped sharpen some of those up quite a lot.
And now you're coming now touch wood, allegedly now we're coming out the other side of it for the time being. I'm not going to make any predictions because every time I do I'm wrong, but now it looks like we're having moving into the summer again, nothing else. What next for you guys at Diabetes UK? What's the plan? Did you lose many volunteers, or did your engagement stay pretty consistent?
I think it's hard to say for certain. I think we saw a lot pause. I don't think we had a lot of people sort of say, that's it, this is the natural break for me, I'm not coming back. I think a lot of people are more in that, I'll come back when I'm ready. And that's, again, that's probably the second message that really formed a lot of our communication with volunteers over the last few years. Your health, safety and well-being is paramount. Don't do anything until you feel ready to do it. And that, for some people that might be a few months, for some people that might be a few years, and that's okay. I think the future for us looks overwhelmingly like it'll be a mix of that online and face-to-face working, and I don't think we're really accepting that by any stretch. We asked volunteers last year how they expected to be volunteering through 2022, and of the responses we got, which we think was enough for statistically valid sample, 2/3 said a mix. It'll be a bit of both. And we've certainly seen that where we have volunteer support groups. So we've got around 280 volunteer support groups across the UK in some guise or another. And I think what they've really seen is that ability to interact and engage with more people in the diabetes because of being online. I even remember, being a volunteer and doing that, 30 minutes in the city centre, a couple of hours to run a meeting, 30 minutes home.
makes such a difference to accessibility and
It
inclusion.
does. It really does. We had some groups that were, I think we had one group based in North of England that was talking to people from Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland at the same time as they were talking to people, from just like 2 miles away down the road. And I think that made a big difference, particularly in the early stages. It helped give people a little bit of a sense of support when kind of doctor's appointments and checks and routine stuff that forms part of everybody's life living with diabetes got turned on its head. There was some kind of the constant there, and I think we still see that now. I was talking to one of our groups in down towards Essex at the end of last week, and trying to go and do that's an entire day out of I live in Sheffield, so kind of getting down to Essex for a couple hours in an evening is a it's a mission. But I can do a day. I can kind of sit in my kitchen for another hour and a half, and I can have what I think is hopefully I'm sure they'll be the judge of it, but hopefully a fairly good experience for everybody. And I think it improves that access to to kind of people like me and to other colleagues as well. It's easy for us to be part of more things.
Within diabetes as well, yours it is such an interesting group, because you've got the people with the type 1 that have been suffering from often from the sort of younger years, the teenage years, when they have the onset, who need are looking for a different sort of support to the type 2 that are often older and maybe come from certain communities that are looking for a different time. They want the face-to-face, they want the social sort of experience, and they're a bit more flexible in the times they can turn up, versus like yourself, you at 21 who needs a bit of help understanding what's going on and what it's going to mean for you, the rest of your life.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, I think that was kind of a really interesting part of the discussion we had, that I had with this group last week, that that digital engagement has brought so many benefits into people that would have been rightly skeptical. Not necessarily not rightly skeptical, but would have been skeptical of that, pre-pandemic. But having to engage in exactly. But kind of having to engage in that to stay connected to family members shows you that you can do it elsewhere. But I think what we've been really clear about, and what we're hearing from our volunteers consistently, is that there's a limit to how much that engagement helps, and the social capital and being in the same room as somebody else. We can't replace that. I don't think we should try to replace it either.
No, I agree.
And I think what we're seeing is we kind of, as you say, it's still 4 o'clock and it's bright outside my window, which is the first time in a long time.
It's not in Manchester. It's snowing down here, so.
Wrong side of the pen, Chris.
You are definitely.
I think what we are seeing is that those groups who, took those personal choices to be slightly more cautious in their return to volunteering, as we get into lighter nights, warmer evenings, will start to do more. And how do we help them to come back after an extended break of being a volunteer and
build
feel
that
like
confidence back in,
exactly
to make that step.
How do you kind of overcome that sort of nervousness and anxiety about meeting people that you've not seen for quite a while, and also balancing that with what you feel are your responsibilities as a volunteer at the same time? It's
practically, give me some examples how you think you're going to manage that, because I think that's a really interesting challenge for an awful lot of organisations at the minute. How do you the re-engagement question? We did some work with the Charity Retail Association, and that a lot of the shops are struggling to get people back in shops, as you can imagine, because it's enclosed and it's quite busy. So what's your thoughts on that sort of re-engagement piece? What are the practical bits of advice you think you might have?
So, I mean, a lot of our kind of practical stuff is kind of the practical and tedious stuff, but we've been really clear about our kind of training that we have got in place for people that want to come back. I think as a slightly more procedural bit, we're looking at how we make sure everybody's up to date and where we think they need to be before they start volunteering again. And the changes that we've put in place because of COVID allow us to restate the importance of that. But we've had pretty much all our teams across all the regions in England and across Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland as well, have had those regular volunteer social evenings. So people have been able to, as other volunteers have been at different stages of their return, they've been able to share those experiences as well.
Peer support.
100%. And we kind of talk about peer support mostly. We think about it for people with diabetes, supporting others living with the condition. But actually, it's volunteer to volunteer support. How are you learning from what that group, kind of in the next county did?
Yeah.
Are you doing something similar? Have you got a question because you're doing something that's quite different? And I think just not forgetting that it's people in the middle of all this. And
Of course, yeah.
you know, we were talking about people giving their time up earlier, but it's more complicated than that. When you know everybody's kind of got different, you know, family circumstances, different commitments, different motivations, you know, different anxieties and fears. We've got, I think, a really important responsibility to help people through those things, and I think it's probably one of the bits we don't talk about enough of as volunteer managers is how much you kind of end up in some of the details of other people's lives.
We should say that me and Ruth finished last week pretty much talking about when you talk about volunteering and it's the largest sense, there's a real danger that it comes across this homogenized single thing volunteering.
Yeah.
But what you've just said there is absolutely hits the nail on the head for me, that it's localized, it's people's lives, it's local friendships, that's the bit that makes people do it, makes people want to do it. And it's really sometimes hard to try and talk about it in this other sense without losing some of that context of what really the job is and what really you end up doing when you're working with volunteers.
Yeah, 100%.
So,
it's breadth and depth. I think there's kind of, you're absolutely right. You can't. We end up, because it probably suits our own purposes to a large degree. I think we talk about volunteering as this kind of concept and this, quite nebulous thing. But I think anybody that's spent any time working in an organisation that involves volunteers, or you know, has done some volunteer management, has talked to a volunteer anywhere, you kind of understand how personal it is for everybody. And I think what's quite interesting for me, I think, is that when we see that a lot with diabetes, so we kind of get that sense of diabetes is this one big nebulous thing, or it's type 1, it's type 2, and you know it's not an unfair generalization.
Yeah, there's elements of that.
But there's
not
kind
the defining factor.
There's 4.5 million people living with diabetes in this country, and I would say that there's 4.5 million different experiences of it. It is, family circumstance, diet, socioeconomic status, all those things mean that, you could meet somebody else. I could meet somebody else that was diagnosed at 21 that's got type 1 diabetes like me, and their journey over the last 20 years will be completely different to mine. And I think, it's stepping away from volunteering for like 60 seconds, but I think that's one of the challenges we have as an organisation, is that it's really difficult to tell individual stories in a compelling way, because there are so many of them, and what I would relate to as a person with diabetes will be completely different to what somebody else would.
Building a consistent narrative is almost impossible when you've got 4 million different versions
exactly.
of the same story.
It's really, really hard, and I think that's, probably going back to what we were talking about 5-10 minutes ago, is how you overlay process onto something that is so people driven is really, really difficult.
It is. Without losing that bit that's important,
exactly. You don't want to stymie or squash the stuff that makes people passionate and motivated to be a volunteer, but at the same time, you've got to balance the risk that you hold as an organisation that's supporting volunteers.
Of course.
It's a difficult one sometimes.
So tell me about your journey into the AVM, the Association of Volunteer Managers. What made you decide that was something you want to be involved in?
So I think my background prior to this job was one of the main drivers. I think feeling quite exposed coming in as a head of volunteering was my first job in a charity, and having had a few years' experience as a volunteer, and quite a lot of other professional experience. I'm not going to put myself down too much, but I sometimes struggle to see how that transferred, and I think that sense of imposter syndrome felt really real. Kind of 5 years ago, I've got no idea what I'm doing here.
I'm a PE teacher that sells software. I get it every single day. Don't worry. I feel
I still get it. I feel kind of slightly more at ease with it now, I think. But I think there was a sense of other people will know how to do this a lot better than I will, and where do you find that? And kind of Twitter, for all its crimes, I suppose. There's a hugely motivated group of people that work in charities and work in volunteering that I was able to connect to. And I think through that,
I think Twitter for volunteering is still probably the place to. It's still my go-to place, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you've kind of got to switch all the rest of it off.
Obviously. I was just about to say the exact same. If I'm not careful, I disappear down a direction I don't often want to go. But but there is a very sort of healthy volunteer manager sort of network on Twitter, which I think is quite useful.
There is, and I think as long as we, and I think we all do, but I think as long as we remind ourselves that that's not the extent of it. That's true for everything in life, isn't it? Twitter is not representative of real life.
No. Thank God.
But I think that was the first thing. I think that was kind of what drove me into how do I find out more from people that are doing this better than I am and know more about it than I do. And I've kind of had that benefit of Twitter from living with diabetes, because that helped me connect to a lot of other people that were living with the condition. And so kind of that must transfer to volunteering, and it did and it does. I think for AVM, I can't remember. Must have been, I went to an event a good few years back when I first started, really.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of grown from there. Relationship with a really good group of people, and what I really aspired to when I started in this role 5 years ago was how do I move volunteering at Diabetes UK to be more of an example that people are looking towards, rather than feeling like I'm trying to catch up to everybody else's examples. And we've maybe done that in some instances, I think.
Maybe that's going back to your sort of corporate thinking again. You're more commercially minded. You see that and you go, okay, that's what we're going to. That your sort of strategy and objective sort of mindset is probably a little bit different sometimes to some of the other colleagues that maybe work at the AVM.
Potentially. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. In terms of the AVM, what you sort of went as a resource, because there's going to be people. Well, I hope there's going to be people listening to this. There may be a person listening to this that isn't currently a member of the AVM. What you tell? Quick advert here. Why should people join? What's it all about?
I think there's a huge amount of benefits. The number of events that we run on different topics throughout the year, I think alone is one of the reasons why I was so attracted to it in the first place. It's not just focused on charity; it's focused on anybody that's working volunteers in any sector, and that's really important because again, for me, I tend to get a little bit of tunnel vision sometimes thinking about charities, thinking about health charities in particular, and volunteering is so much richer than that. And AVM supports anybody working with volunteers in any organisation. I think that's really critical. Incredible conference every year, which is done brilliantly to weather the storm of COVID and kind of sustain itself in a really practical and engaging way online over the last couple of years.
I've got to say, it's always one of my favourite events because they always have such interesting speakers.
Yeah, definitely. And I even kind of survived it last year when I had to kind of moderate one of the busier workshops as well. So if I can I can come through that unscathed, it's such a good experience, and there's so much kind of networking that goes on that. There's there's kind of online forums and groups, kind of volunteer manager book club, all these sorts of things that you can get involved in when you want to. And I think that power of community is the really important thing. And we see it through volunteering, and we see it in volunteer management, that there are so many other people out there that are willing to share their experience, willing to tell you, the kind of the things that they've, had success with, the pitfalls that they've had at the same time. None of us are in this to be better than anybody else. We're all in this to kind of, going back to that argument from earlier, but we're all in this to kind of feel like we're making a positive difference. And people are always so incredibly welcoming to do that. And that network at AVM, I think, has been hugely valuable for me over the years.
That's it's really interesting, I think, as well, that being a volunteer manager, it can be a little bit of a lonely experience because often, you're working with volunteers that aren't employees, so they've got their, like I say, they've got their own set of motivations, and it's a recurring theme that comes up for a lot of people I've spoken to, that you can often feel a little bit isolated with an organisation as a volunteer manager because you kind of HR, you're kind of fundraising, you're kind of this, you're kind of that. So I think something like the AVM offers that opportunity to talk to other people that are in a very similar boat to you and have shared experience with that same sort of sense of that same feeling. The other thing that's come up a few times is this idea about how we potentially professionalise the sector, professionalise the role of a volunteer manager, and maybe what role the AVM could play in that moving forward. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that as the director of the organisation.
I mean, I think I definitely think a lot of things that you said, absolutely resonate with me. I think it does feel, I mean, I'm not even directly managing, volunteers these days, but that sense of it can feel like quite an isolated thing because you're expected to know so much about so much. Even though we've got wonderful colleagues that know much more about fundraising regulation than I do, I've still got to understand it enough. I've still got to understand,
of course,
safeguarding to a much greater degree than I otherwise would. I've still got to understand GDPR. I've still got to understand, kind of complaints procedure. I've still got to understand how to, be able to talk to and manage people that have got the ability to just say, no, this is not for me.
Yeah, it's like everything you have to do in HR, but without any of the sort of sticks to use to get people to do what you want in HR.
Yeah, no contract with kind of supporting you in the background. And I think we would all benefit from more people understanding the breadth of skill that you need to work with volunteers and be a volunteer manager. And I think kind of professionalizing that can only really help.
Yeah.
Exactly what it looks like, I'm not going to hazard a guess at an answer just now, but I think it's probably very misunderstood as an occupation, as a profession. I think we talk a lot more about. Well, we're trying to talk a lot more internally about how we think about community practice for our volunteer managers. How are we kind of sharing best practice? How are we talking about the skills and the competencies and the capabilities that we need to be able to do this role? Because it is so broad, it can, no 2 days are ever the same.
It can overwhelm if you're not careful.
Yeah, 100%. It can, and I think I don't feel like I see that on a day-to-day basis. I don't see people being overwhelmed, but I see that kind of Monday is different to Tuesday is different to Wednesday, and you've got to be able to context switch so often.
Yeah,
it's
and like you say, knowing where to go and get the appropriate information. Sometimes that again, an organisation like AVM can help you with that much.
Yeah.
If you are dropping into safeguard and then you're dropping into recruitment and you're dropping, having that set of people that have generally one or two of them are expert in any one of those things is quite a useful resource to have.
100%,
have to hand, definitely.
Yeah.
Nearly there. You'd be glad to know. There's not much longer left. I guess what I'd like to finish on is what's next for the sector. What are your thoughts? There's a lot of talk at the minute around this idea around passporting. There's the work going on around the volunteer. What's it? The
vision for volunteering.
The vision for volunteering. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, vision for volunteering stuff. So there's some big pieces of work going on, sector wide. There was the paper that came out a couple of years ago from government. What's your thoughts? What are the next? What's the next things that we need to have on our radar?
Yeah, you said we're near the end as well. I think there's a few things in there. I think there's an interesting balancing act between the amount of time that people are going to have to give in the future and the way they want to give it. It's got to be an absolute prime concern for us as volunteer managers and any organisation working with volunteers. I was in a meeting this morning, quite interestingly, about if me as head of volunteering at Diabetes UK or any other organisation comes out and says, this is what we want, this is how we want you to do it, this is where and when we want you to do it, you will be met with stone silence, because we don't have the position of power in that relationship. I think that's really interesting to remember, that volunteers hold a lot more of the power in that relationship than maybe they're aware of sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think maybe that we're aware of sometimes as volunteer managers. I think we sometimes
I would agree with that.
Get that, because we feel like we're involved in the kind of day-to-day.
You've got your pressures. You've got to hit this. You've got to do that. You've got to do this, and the assumption is these people are just out there and they'll do it for you, and it's that's not
one
the case.
One of the biggest misconceptions that I've kind of seen coming into working in the charity is that people that don't work with volunteers on a day-to-day basis think that they are available at the top of a hat.
Yeah, and they cost nothing. They're free. You don't have to invest anything in them.
And I've got a drawer full of people waiting to do something, and that's not how people's lives work. And I think there's a huge amount of change coming for people that are going to need more support from organisations, from volunteers.
Yeah,
I think we're already seeing people struggling to make difficult life choices as kind of cost of living goes up, needing more support. How are we best able to meet the needs of people that most need organisations like ours, but in a way that harnesses the skills and expertise that people who would be willing to volunteer, can give up. We are kind of, the matchmaker in the middle.
Yep.
But, we are kind of coming into that with our own sort of requirements around,
Of course, yeah.
Our perception of mission, our perception of value, how we're best able to get the most from people's time, where they can give it, how we, spend that money that, that is earned by organisations like ours in the most responsible way.
Yep.
And, you don't want to get paralysed by that, but you also don't want to live in constant fear that you're not doing it as well as you could.
Yeah, again, you started, you were not returning value. That's what it's about, isn't it? Yeah.
It is, kind of, if you, I'll kind of go back to my volunteering days. If I spent 6 hours at a, at a local fair and I've raised 500 quid, I want to feel that my 6 hours
was
is
worth
my 500 quid in the scheme of a £30 million organisation. Yeah, I get it's not much, but that's 6 hours of my time. And how is that? What's that value like to the organisation? And I don't think we highlight, and I don't think we make that really visible very, very easily or very often. But I think the general hardest thing for us is going to be so much interconnected change that's coming up. I think if you ask volunteers what they'd want us to do away with paperwork and admin and process, because it feels like it gets in the way. We talk a lot about nobody volunteers to do paperwork, and that is, I think, 99% true. So how do we make the paperwork as low cost, as low effort, as least intrusive as possible?
We have an ongoing conversation in the office here about this continuum of formality to informality, and where people sit on that continuum, what people are willing to do. And although we say it's from formality to informality, really it's from informality to slightly less informal, really. And people don't want to do anything. I mean, they don't really want to read the email you send them. They don't really, when you're talking about that kind of level of stuff, so it's how can you make sure that you reduce the white noise as much as possible and send them stuff that really matters to them? And again, digital has a place to play in that, but it's difficult for organizations at organization level, when they've got certain things they want to get out, to try and achieve that level of targeted customization to the individual volunteers. It's a real challenge, I think.
I think so. I think we kind of talked a little bit about, I kind of might be misremembering quite a lot of my degree, but I think we talked a lot about principal agent problems to some degree. Kind of, we feel like we are best placed to understand the wider landscape and the place that we occupy in it, but people don't want to hear that from us. They want to hear, this is what I care about doing, this is where my passion is, I want to carry on doing that. And it's not that organizations don't value it, it's that actually our worldview, from what we see, and the people that we have conversations with, says that actually doing something completely different is going to bring the most benefit to most other people, and we have a responsibility to do that. But it doesn't mean we don't value the time and effort that we get from everybody. It's just that we've got to make difficult decisions at the end of the day.
There's only so much time you've got to respond to that sort of. Yeah, I'm glad we got some economics in the end there, though. Squeeze that right in the
I vaguely remember it after all this time. But I mean, I think you're talking then about kind of passporting, and I think if we could solve that, that'd be huge.
It's a really interesting one for me, because it's almost, at the minute, it's a problem. It's a solution looking for a problem. In that, for the volunteer, it doesn't really do enough for them to make it worth the effort they'll have to go through to achieve it. For the organisations, it looks great, but the actual the inter-organisational issues that come with it are actually maybe too large, unless you're doing it between one or two organisations, become too large to get over. So it's like, we've got the solution. We've been doing an awful lot of work around this idea of using services like Yoti and the DBS and being able to link these things and having a QR code that make it transferable. We think all this is really, we think that there might be some killer features that might help it get more adoption. Something like DBS will be a really big one. Right to work and things like that, if you already have to have some of this software in place on your phone for other things. But I'm not 100% convinced just yet of that it's going to be any use for the next couple of years. I feel we're maybe 3 or 4 years before something else will happen and drive it on, the adoption of it, and volunteering will then be able to piggyback on the back of that somehow.
I don't think I disagree with that. I think what's interesting for us is we see a lot of people coming to us from a professional background where, you know, they have to have their own DVS, they've got their own safeguarding requirements. You know, we see a lot of people coming from either healthcare organisations or from schools in particular.
Yeah.
You know, so teachers, doctors, nurses, you know, very professional, very qualified, very intelligent people that have got all these things in place.
And you've got to start again with them.
You've got to start again. And actually, you can see that there would be a huge amount of value in that, but I'm not quite sure it would, in its current form, it would be sophisticated enough that actually means you're not just pushing the problem somewhere else.
Exactly.
Actually, probably pushing more of the problem onto the volunteer.
Yeah.
Which probably ends up being a poor experience. And I think, again, that's one of those things that's really, really difficult to articulate. When somebody says to you, I've already got a DVS, just use that. And you don't want to get into, but we can't for these reasons. But because it feels like a cop-out. It feels like you're not really owning the problem that you've got, but actually you don't really have any control over it. You are.
No, and you get sick of that conversation, but you got to keep it having it. And it's, frustrating. Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that we've not covered? Anything that, you know, on your mind around volunteering that you'd like to get off at the minute?
I think there's just kind of one thing that comes to me quite often, which is that I think sometimes being a volunteer manager is a little bit like being a celebrity, but without any of the benefits of being a celebrity. And I think
I'd like to hear this. Go on.
I think a lot of it is conversations where, you know, nobody has the full information set. So, you know, I'm talking as somebody who's a volunteer manager of sorts. From my perspective, volunteers will talk to me from their perspective, and actually everybody feels like they're entitled to an opinion, and everybody's opinion is equal.
Yeah.
But actually, I'm not I'm not waking up and driving my Aston Martin down to Waitrose to do my shopping or anything. I'm just getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning. I'm coming to sit in my kitchen.
Yeah.
And that kind of the difficulty that we have in articulating the constraints that we operate in as, you know, as charities, as organisations involving volunteers, it's so nuanced and it's so complicated that you can never put that convincing picture out there.
It's very hard to get a simplistic explanation of why you're doing what you're doing. It's because it's never simplistic. Yeah.
It's not at all. And you've kind of got 2,000 people saying, actually, I think you're wrong for this reason. And it's like, I get it.
Everyone loves being told they're wrong 2,000 times.
Yeah. And I think there's something that, you know, we kind of talked earlier about, you know, how it feels quite isolating sometimes as a volunteer manager. And I think there is, because there is that real difference in perspective and knowledge, you know, across the table sometimes. And it's very difficult, as you say, people only want to hear the bare minimum that they need to know to do what they want to do.
Of course.
So the only way you kind of get to put the kind of context and the meat on the bone is that you go around and you talk to groups of volunteers, you know, 5, 10, 15 of them at a time. And, you know, when you've got 2,000 volunteers, you're never going to get to the end of that.
No.
And 2,000 is probably on a lower scale for a lot of charities as well. So I think you can end up feeling quite isolated, feeling like you're saying the same thing. And
sometimes it feels like screaming into the void, I should imagine.
Sometimes, and I'm sure, you know, kind of we all have that in whatever role we work in and whatever job we do.
Yeah.
And I think there's sometimes that sense of, how do you...
Well, you've got 2,000 people that feel they own the organisation in their own little way. And you're the organisation, you've got to tell them that you do, but not quite as much as you think you do. And this is the reason we're doing this, because that in and of itself is an exhausting part of the job. You know, all the other bits that are amazing and great, we know all them, we get the sense of it, but the bit that can tire you out is having that ongoing two-way conversation with people that don't really want to hear your side of it all that much.
I mean, and it kind of makes me feel like I'm sort of ending on a bit of a low note there, and I really don't mean to. I think, you know,
no, I think that's a good thing to go away from for volunteer managers to have a think about. I think it's a really valid point to finish on, that, you know, there is what's the word I'm looking for, where you have to be, there is a consistency required in the sort of the nature of the person that does the job, that you have to have that about you to be able to do it.
I think you've got to be incredibly resilient to do this kind of work.
That's the word I was looking for.
I don't think, and, you know, it's kind of surprised me as a volunteer, and, you know, I kind of look back on some of my volunteering experiences and I'm thinking, God, I must have put some people right through the ringer for, you know, really not understanding what they were having to go through and what they were having to deal with, and me asking something that felt really easy and looking back.
You telling them how they're doing the job wrong.
Yeah, that poor person. And, you kind of feel like you want to go and apologise to all these people, that have left the organisation things. But I've seen it from both sides as a real benefit, but actually I think there's a huge amount of personal resilience that you need. And because you are dealing with people, things become quite personal quite quickly, and not like in a nasty or vindictive way, but it becomes...
Well, it matters.
Yeah, it does. It matters. It matters to everybody. And I think it's important that we never lose that in those conversations about, why have I got to do X or Y? And it's like, we're all on the same side. We're all trying to achieve the same thing. And actually,
you pulled it around quite nicely there at the end. Yeah, you made it nice and positive to finish it there. That's it.
I would genuinely say that I've met, not just in terms of, through AVM and the number of colleagues that I've met. I generally go back to my second week in the job was NCVO conference in London.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of just like this, schoolboy on like the first day of term, not knowing where to go. Everybody kind of knows everybody else already, and I'm just like, I don't even know what this building is. I don't live in London. I've got no idea where I'm going at all. I'm sat there, there with my little carrier bag full of stuff, and thinking about honestly, my little packed lunch and stuff, and thinking about how many people I knew in that first week working in volunteering, and think about the relationships I built across a number of organisations, with a huge number of colleagues internally and at other charities, and thinking about the number of volunteers that I've met and that richness of that experience that they've got, and the fondness that they talk about, being a volunteer with Diabetes UK. It's incredible, and I think we. And I am absolutely the same as anybody else. I think sometimes we are too quick to dwell on the little bits that we find frustrating sometimes, and that reflection of, actually, I talked to somebody the other day, and they'd had a life-changing experience by being a volunteer, and we're helping to facilitate that. It's not all down to us by any stretch, but we're part of that. And I think,
like you say, it's that balance of recognising how important it is to them, what you need as an organisation, is somehow mashing all that up that you end up all moving in roughly the same direction.
Yeah, it is. It's how do you? I think we get a lot of us get caught up in strategy and planning, and then implementation and I think we lose that human element that sits in the middle of all these things. And it's important that we do. It's important that we're not just all running off in 2 dozen directions and not really thinking about how we achieve the best for the people we're here to support, but at the same time we shouldn't let that paralyze us. And I think it's a really, really fine line where you are able to talk succinctly about what your organisation is trying to do, how volunteers fit into that, and do that in a convincing way so that everybody feels like they own it and they're part of that. I don't think any of us have backed that particularly well. So I think that's certainly where we need to get to in amongst all this kind of societal change that we're all living through still.
Well, it sounds like you're the man for the job at Diabetes UK. You are certainly empathetic enough to recognise it. So it's been lovely to talk to you, and hopefully we'll get to actually meet up in real life in sometime in the relatively near future, and have a piece of cake and a cup of tea at an event or something.
Absolutely, volunteering running tea and cake. So I'm
all over it. Yeah. I'm not sure. You be Diabetes UK, you'd maybe just have the cup of tea. And
no. If there's cake, I'm having cake. Don't worry about that.
my diabetic mate's always got the best sweets. So
that's it. Yeah, we know exactly what we're talking about.
Well, cheers for your time, Andy. It's been really appreciated, and we'll speak to you soon. Take care.
Great. Take care.